Everyone laughed when the Chinese billionaire mocked the black waiter until he replied fluently in Chinese. In the heart of an extravagant hotel in Shanghai, the chandeliers glittered above a grand banquet hall filled with powerful men and women. Business tycoons, diplomats, and social elites filled the tables, their conversations buzzing with wealth and influence. Waiters moved quietly through the room, serving drinks and dishes with precision. Among them was David, a tall, composed, black man who had come to China not only to study international business but also to support himself by working evenings as a waiter. His presence was calm, his movements professional, though many guests barely noticed him. For them, he was just another face in the background, someone meant to serve and then disappear. That night, however, was destined to be different. At the center of one of the most lavish tables sat Jiang Wei, a billionaire who built his fortune in real estate and technology. He was powerful, feared, and known for his arrogance. Those around him laughed at every word, not because of his wit, but because his wealth demanded their approval. When David approached with a tray of wine, he leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing with a smirk that hinted at trouble. In Mandarin, he cracked a cruel joke about David, mocking both his race and his position as a servant. The table erupted. In laughter, their voices loud and sharp, echoing across the golden hall. The other waiters glanced nervously at each other, unsure of how to react. Some looked away, pretending not to hear, while others stood frozen, uncomfortable but powerless to intervene. The laughter was cruel, and it carried an undertone of superiority that stung the air. David stood still, his hands steady on the tray, his expression unreadable. He had endured prejudice before, but never on such a grand stage and never from someone with such public authority. Yet, instead of showing anger or shame, he lifted his gaze, meeting Jiang Wei's eyes with calm dignity. The guests waited for him to fumble, to walk away quietly, perhaps even to shrink beneath their laughter. But what they didn't know was that David had prepared for moments like this all his life. While they assumed he was just another foreigner working to get by, he carried with him years of discipline, knowledge, and respect for the culture around him. Little did they expect that within moments, the same hall that now rang with mocking laughter would fall into stunned silence. David inhaled slowly, the weight of every eye upon him, and prepared a reply that none of them would ever forget. Laughter spread across the grand banquet hall, echoing off the marble walls and crystal chandeliers. Jiang Wei leaned back in his chair, the pride on his face unmistakable, as though humiliating another man somehow made him greater. His companions clapped and chuckled, some hiding their cruel delight behind the rims of their wine glasses. David stood still, the tray balanced steadily in his hands, his eyes calm, though his heart burned with quiet fire. He had been insulted before, but this was different. It was public, deliberate, and aimed to strip away his dignity in front of an audience. The whispers began immediately among the guests, some shaking their heads in discomfort while others smirked, eager to see how he would respond. One man, trying to excuse Jiang's cruelty, leaned forward and sneered, telling David not to take it seriously, insisting that he probably didn't even understand the words being said. For a moment, the room seemed frozen, waiting to see whether David would bow his head and walk away or whether anger would break his composure. But then a small, confident smile appeared on his lips. He lifted his chin slightly, looked Jiang Wei directly in the eyes, and spoke in flawless Mandarin. His words were calm, steady, and sharp as steel. "Sir, your joke is amusing, but it reveals far more about yourself than it does about me." The effect was immediate. The entire hall fell into silence, as if someone had extinguished the laughter with a single breath. Glasses hung mid-air, forks stopped halfway to mouths, and every head turned toward the waiter who had just shattered their assumptions. Whispers rippled through the crowd like waves in a storm. Some gasped in disbelief, muttering to each other, in shock. "He speaks Chinese?" one voice whispered, and "fluently," another replied, astonished. Zhang Wei's smug smile vanished, replaced by a tightness in his jaw, his face stiff and unsettled. He had expected his target to be helpless, to be too foreign, too insignificant to respond. Yet here he stood, replying with dignity in the very language Zhang thought would be his weapon. David did not stop there. With the confidence of someone who had studied the culture deeply and lived among its people with respect, he addressed the table again in Mandarin, his tone calm but commanding. He reminded them that language is not only about words, but about respect, and that respect itself knows no color, no title, no wealth. The message was not delivered in anger or bitterness, but with a wisdom that pierced deeper than insult ever could. Those who had laughed now shifted uneasily in their seats, their laughter replaced by shame. In that moment, the waiter they had dismissed as invisible had become the center of the room, not because of wealth or power, but because he held on to something far greater: dignity. The shift in the banquet hall was almost tangible, as if the very air had changed. Just moments before it had been filled with mocking laughter, but now silence and awe hung heavy over the long tables. Guests who had joined in the cruel amusement lowered their eyes in shame, while a few, unable to contain their admiration, began to clap softly. The sound was hesitant at first, but it carried a weight that made others glance around uneasily. A senior diplomat seated near the head of the table finally broke the silence, clearing his throat before speaking in a measured tone. He admitted aloud that the young waiter spoke Mandarin with more grace and fluency than many who were born to it, and that such effort showed true respect for the culture. His words struck the crowd deeply, for everyone knew they were true. What David had displayed was not merely a command of language, but a mastery of dignity itself. Zhang Wei shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushed red with embarrassment. The proud expression he had worn so easily moments ago had been stripped away, leaving him exposed in front of his peers. Desperate to reclaim his authority, he leaned forward, his voice low and defensive, muttering that speaking Mandarin didn't mean David belonged among them. But his words rang hollow, weak, and without the weight they once carried. The arrogance that had drawn laughter now seemed petty and small in comparison to the waiter's calm composure. David did not falter. With the same quiet strength that had carried him through the humiliation, he bowed slightly, his voice once again carrying across the hall in perfect Mandarin. "It is my job to serve," he said steadily, "but dignity is not something others give me. It is something I earn, myself." The sentence struck the room like a thunderclap, each word ringing with truth that could not be ignored. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking at Zhang Wei, others at David, realizing who truly commanded the respect of the room. For the first time, Zhang Wei had no reply. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. The man who had once controlled every conversation with his wealth and arrogance was left utterly speechless, silenced not by anger, but by a servant's dignity. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult, for it revealed the truth everyone could see, that in that moment, power did not lie with the billionaire at the table, but with the waiter who stood before him, unshaken and proud. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere in the grand banquet hall had completely transformed. What had begun as an evening of arrogance and mockery had turned into a lesson no one would forget. The same guests who once laughed at David now approached him quietly, offering words of respect and admiration. They praised not just his fluency in Mandarin, but the way he carried himself with grace under pressure, never raising his voice, never losing his composure. Some of them admitted softly that they felt ashamed for having joined in the laughter, while others confessed that they were moved by his strength. A few even told him, "You represent the future, where respect is not about wealth, race, or background, but about character." These words carried far more value to David than applause ever could, because they came from people who had witnessed his dignity shine through humiliation. Meanwhile, Jiang Wei sat in silence, his face hard, to read but his defeat undeniable. For the first time in years, his wealth and authority had failed to protect him from the truth. He rose from his chair without the same swagger he had entered with, his steps quiet as he left the hall. He was not humiliated because he lost a verbal battle, but because a man he thought beneath him revealed a wisdom and strength that billions of dollars could never buy. His exit spoke louder than words. The once untouchable billionaire had been humbled by a waiter. Later that night, after the guests had left and the tables were cleared, David was called into the hotel manager's office. He expected a lecture, perhaps even a reprimand for speaking out in front of such powerful men. Instead, the manager stood from behind his desk, extended his hand firmly, and looked David in the eye. "Tonight, you reminded everyone of something we too often forget," he said, his voice sincere. "Dignity has no price, and true respect cannot be bought." Those words struck David deeply, because they confirmed that his actions had not only defended his own honor, but had left an impact on everyone present. The following week, David's life changed in ways he hadn't expected. The hotel management offered him a new position, no longer as a waiter, but as a cultural liaison officer, a role where he would work directly with international clients and represent the values of the establishment. It was a recognition not only of his skills, but of the character he had shown in the face of cruelty. Yet, for David, the promotion was not the real victory. What mattered most was the knowledge that he had stood tall when it counted, that he had turned laughter into silence, and silence into respect. He had shown that dignity is not granted by others, but earned through strength of character. And so, the billionaire who mocked the waiter learned the hardest lesson of all, that true respect belongs not to the arrogant, but to those who carry themselves with honor